Okay, so thank you to COTA New South Wales for inviting me to speak today. Now, this is a forum about death, but for a moment I'd like you to think about birth. So think about birth 50 years ago. Generally, women had very little say in the lead up to the birth of their child. They were expected to deliver in silence. They were expected to deliver alone, without the support of their partner or their families. They were almost always in the clinical, sterile environment of a hospital, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, mostly male, and unsympathetic people. They were expected to lie still and bring their baby into the world without a word of complaint. Well, how things have changed in half a century, and I should know. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, so I've been through this quite recently. And now birthing is all about the experience. So today, most women in Australia have considerable choice in how they birth. We can choose where we give birth, whether that's at home, in a birthing centre, in a hospital. We can choose who looks after us during our birth, whether that be an obstetrician, a midwife, or we can even hire someone called a doula. We can choose who accompanies us during the delivery, whether that be our partner, our family, our friends, or even our children, which I did not do. We can even have access to the most amazing array of things designed to deliver the kind of birth experience that we want, whether that be water baths, music, balls, beanbags, stools, you name it, they've got it. So, leaving aside the issue of spiralling rates of caesareans and all those sorts of things, it's fair to say that birth has come a long way. Death, on the other hand, languishes far behind in a dark, forgotten, powerless and miserable corner. We dread what will happen to us in our dying days and hours. We fear the loss of dignity and control. We fear the suffering we assume is inevitable. We fear an end where everything human is stripped from us and we are reduced to a state that is neither alive nor dead. We fear dying alone, leaving so much unheard and unsaid. But it doesn't have to be this way. I believe we have the opportunity to reclaim death, to take control of our experience of death the way that we have been able to do with birth, and to demand the same choices in death as we now have in birth. Now, it's also worth saying that as with birth, anything can happen. Again, I know. And the best laid plans of mothers and mortals often go astray. So this is not about making a definitive plan that has to be followed to the letter, because it never will be. But what this is, it's about considering the options. It's about deciding what we would like to happen, but it's also about deciding what we absolutely don't want to happen when we find ourselves at death's door. But to do that, we need to talk about death. We need to think about death, our own death and the death of our loved ones, and decide the kind of death we want. So how do we control our experience of death? Well, again, I go back to the choices that I had not so long ago with the birth of my own children. So where we die, as we've just heard, has a huge effect on our experience of death. So I'd like to tell you about Neil. So Neil was 31 when he was diagnosed with cancer, and 4 years later he was dying. He'd been in and out of hospital for so long, for so much of his illness, and he absolutely hated it. And in the weeks before his death, he became increasingly angry and frustrated at being stuck in hospital when it was clear that there was little they could do for him. So the turning point actually came the day before he died. And there was a conference with Neil, his father, his specialist, and a nurse from the Macmillan, was a UK cancer care charity. And the nurse asked Neil what he wanted, and he said, "I want to go home." So, with the help from the hospital and all of his family and the Macmillan nurse, they hired equipment, they arranged transport, and finally the next day everything was ready for Neil to return home. Now, the amazing thing about this, aside from the fact that he got home, was that despite having been bedridden for so long, Neil actually found the strength to walk from the ambulance into his flat. He had a plate of chips, a very large glass of whiskey. He watched an episode of The Simpsons, as you do, and then he went to bed. And an hour later, he died at home in his father's arms. Now, it took some time, but Neil finally got his wish to die at home. And it's a wish, as we know, many of us share. Yet, the majority of Australians will see out their final weeks, days and hours in hospital, and often in intensive care, which is a place that even intensive care specialists think is the worst place to die. And this is a shame because there are choices. Dying at home is a choice. It may not be always easy, and it does require specialist support and it requires planning, but if you can plan this far enough in advance and make your wishes known, it is possible. Another important option is hospice care. Oops, sorry, there's our intensive care slide. So hospices can be somewhere between hospital and dying at home. They provide a haven for the dying. They can offer a comfortable, caring, considered environment. And hospices are about addressing not only the physical, but also the spiritual, psychological and social elements of the end of life. And equally importantly, hospices are not just about the patient, but also about their family and friends. So the next question is who? Ooh. It's important to think about who you want to accompany you on this final journey. So the classic tableau of death is that the person on the bed surrounded by this multitude of grieving family and friends, and for many this is a scene of great comfort. But some others cherish their privacy and cherish their solitude. I mean, we don't always want everybody sitting around watching us when we're feeling ill. Sometimes you just want to be alone, and it's no different when you're dying. And it's worth considering these things ahead of time, even though it might seem like such a small decision. So, for example, I mean, do you want a priest? Do you want a nun? Do you want a bishop? Who do you want to be there with you? So for Heather's uncle, this was a very big decision, and unfortunately it was made at the last minute. So he was just a few days from death when his niece Heather asked him if he was scared, and he said yes, he was. So she asked him if he wanted to speak to someone, and she knew instinctively, even though her uncle was not a religious man, she knew instinctively that this meant a priest. And he said, yes, I do. So Heather and her brother, standing at the window of this hospital thinking, where do we get a priest? So they literally left the hospital. I think they could see a college, a Catholic college over the road. They went over to the church and actually found a chaplain who had an hour spare before Mass. So he came back to the hospital with them. And he spent an hour with Heather's uncle. Obviously, Heather and her brother weren't there, but they never got the chance to speak to their uncle again. He lapsed back into unconsciousness. But she later heard from her father that the visit from the priest made a huge difference to his state of mind. So the lesson is, don't leave it to the last minute. Now, another thing to consider, in birth, women often have the option of a midwife or a doula. So this is a kind of, sorry, I keep forgetting about my slides. This is a kind of a personal birth assistant. And now a growing number of people are actually offering this same service to the dying. So they call themselves death midwives or death doulas or death walkers, death shamans. There's a range of names for them. But basically their role is to assist, to accompany and to advocate on that final journey. They can offer very practical help and guidance. They can act as an intermediary between the dying person and their family and the medical profession. They can answer questions. They can offer advice. But they can also be more of a spiritual companion to work with the dying and their families to help them resolve a life and to achieve closure. So the next question is, well, how do you want to die? The knee-jerk answer is probably, I don't, which is a very sensible thing to say. But unfortunately, we all will. So the question is, how do you want to experience death? Now, Woody Allen has famously said, I'm not afraid of death, I just don't want to be there when it happens. And this is a choice. We can choose to be eased into sleep. I'd like to tell you another story that a palliative care doctor told me about a middle-aged patient with motor neurone disease. So this awful, awful disease had really taken its toll on his ability to breathe, and every breath was a struggle, and he was scared and he was panicked and he was fighting harder and harder for every breath. Now his symptoms were intractable. There really wasn't very much they could do for him, so he asked for help. And the doctors had one last thing they could offer. They put him into a state of sedation. It's not unlike a general anaesthetic. In that state, he was not going to feel pain, he was not going to be suffering, but he would be alive. So beforehand, he had the chance to say goodbye to his loved ones and he shared a meal with them. And then he was put under sedation. And despite the weakness of his respiratory muscles, he actually lived for another 48 hours in that unconscious state. So while awake, he had loved sitting outside. So after he was sedated, the nurses would take his bed out to the hospital grounds every day. So one morning they took him outside, they faced his bed towards the lake, and the morning mist was clearing and he died with the sun on his face. And the doctor said it was a bloody magnificent death. Now, a contrast to this, which is not necessarily a bad contrast, is Dave. So just 8 weeks after being diagnosed with a tumour behind his ear, he was near death. But he chose to face death awake and alert. He refused sedation and he only wanted a bare minimum of pain relief. He had to fight very hard not to get more pain relief, if that makes sense. So his wife Angela was with him when he took his last breaths and he was awake and communicating. And what was most extraordinary about this exchange was that she said to him, "Honey, can you see the light?" And he nodded. Now, this tumour was right at the base of his neck. Until that, he had not been able to move his head at all. But he nodded. And she said, "Will you go into that light and you rest?" And he nodded again and he died. But he did it his way. So these stories are extremes, but they illustrate that we do have a choice in how we die. We can choose to fight to the last breath, to have every possible intervention, or we can choose to be kept comfortable, to be able to communicate with our loved ones, and even if that means that we might have a little bit less time with them. But with all of these choices, they have to be considered in advance. Think about them and make your preferences known while you are still able to communicate and record your wishes. Because once you're intubated in intensive care, it's too late and your choices are very limited. There is also one actually last option you could do, which a number of people are doing, which is to actually get "Do Not Resuscitate" tattooed on your chest. And this is a growing popular tattoo, and there's one woman who was so determined not to leave anything to chance that she had "Do Not Resuscitate" on her chest and "Please turn over" on her shoulders. So we tend to see ourselves as utterly powerless in the face of death and that it will take us at the time of its choosing. But in fact, we have a lot of control over when we die. So how often have you heard stories like Penny's? You know, her mother was the matriarch of this large family, grandchildren and everything, and they were all at her bedside. They'd kept up this long vigil. You know, she was dying, wasn't very conscious, and they'd been there all day waiting for her to take her last breath. Every now and then she'd kind of open an eye, maybe just regard them all, smile, and slip back into unconsciousness. And then finally, at the end of this long day, it was decided that an elderly aunt should be taken home. So the whole family made their way out of the room to say farewell, and at the doorway something made Penny change her mind. She thought, "I'll stay with my mother," and she turned around, and in that instant her mother had died. But then there's the opposite, people hanging on against all the odds, waiting and waiting for something. There was a young man that another palliative care nurse, Janine, had met, and she was looking after him. She met him on a Thursday night, and he was in terrible, terrible state. And when she arrived at work the next morning, she was actually shocked to find that he was still alive. He had survived the night. So she asked the man's wife if there was something he was waiting for. And this was a Friday morning. And his wife said that the man's father, mother and brother were arriving a few days later. Now, Janine said just something had to be done because this man was so miserable. He was suffering so much, but he was fighting so hard to stay alive. So she asked the man's wife to get his family on the phone. So she did so, and the man spent about half an hour talking with them. And when the conversation had finished, he hung up the phone, he looked at his wife, he said, "I will always love you," and he died. Now, this is not necessarily a choice that we make ahead of time, but I've found it of some comfort to think that at the very end, we are not quite as powerless as we think. So, anyway, the point that I'm making with this is that we have choices. And at this point in time, when we're reasonably hale and hearty, when we're able to think clearly, to research, to talk, to write, to ask ourselves these questions, we have choices. But unless we start asking ourselves these questions well ahead of our appointed hour, our choices will reduce and reduce as we approach the end, until it will get too late and we will have no real choices at all. We have this strange unconscious belief that talking about death or planning for it will somehow bring it closer. And I actually found this very recently. I was finally got around to writing down all these important passwords and bank account numbers for my husband because he has no idea about that sort of thing. I thought I'd better write this down in case I get hit by the proverbial bus. And as soon as I did, and I gave it to him, I thought, well, I'll probably die now. That's taken care of. And I had to laugh it away. It's silly, it's irrational, but it's so real, you know. But the other thing to note is that I felt a small sense of relief that if that awful event is to occur, that I've taken away a tiny part of the burden that he would bear. And that was a fear that I did have in those wee hours of the night when you can't sleep. It's like, what if that happened? What would he do? How would he cope? So ask yourself, what kind of death do you want? But also ask yourself, what do you fear about death? Because working out what it is about death that frightens you is a big, big step towards addressing those fears. Are you afraid of pain? Well, look into what palliative care can do. Talk to a palliative care professional. Are you afraid of ending up on a ventilator in intensive care? Look into advanced directives. Are you afraid of being left alone? Well, talk to your loved ones about it. Tell them. Let them know so that when the time comes, they can do what they need to do to be there. Are you afraid of things left unsaid and undone? Well, say them and do them now. So I don't really have the answers. I mean, I'm 38 and I'm still dealing with nappies. But what I hope to have done today is to at least inspire you to start asking and thinking about the questions.